I,
Tell us your name.
I'm John Gumerman, the father of George John Gumerman, and the son of George John Gumerman. We're in Flagstaff, Arizona, where I used to work at the Museum of Northern Arizona, but we now live in a retirement community. Uh, this was in the era of salvage archaeology, and they had an internship for a graduate student at the University of Arizona. And I had been in school since God knows when, since I was a little kid. And so I decided before getting my PhD that I wanted to do some real archaeology. And that was when salvage archaeology, the highways were being built in northern Arizona, and other construction, and traveled all over northern Arizona. I got to know lots of little places and rural people who had been in an area like Fredonia, a little town in northern Arizona north of the Grand Canyon. And it was wonderful. I got to know people and know the countryside. Primarily interested in Mesoamerica as an undergraduate. And even when I went to Arizona, I graduated from Columbia in New York City, going to Tucson, which was quite an experience. I'd never been in the Southwest before. And I still was interested in Mesoamerica. In fact, I went to my first year there, I went to a field school at Mexico City College, which existed at that time. It was down in Oaxaca. But then I came back to Arizona, and MNA, the Museum of Northern Arizona, had a fellowship for a graduate student. And that got me interested in Southwestern archaeology. Well, Emil Howry, he was there, and people like Ted Sales and Ned Danson, old great names in anthropology in general. It was a great training. Seeing these now legends in anthropology. When I went there, I took the Black Mesa Archaeological Project along with it, and which was huge in those days for that time in contract archaeology. And lots of the students got interested in Southwestern archaeology, and it was a nice combination. The summer on Black Mesa with the black gnats that bothered us all summer long, and then back to Carbondale. They had J. Charles Kelly, who was quite well known in the Southwest and Mesoamerica, and he brought Walter W. Taylor there. I mean, SIU was a rural, not very well known, not highly regarded as the Ivy Leagues or other major universities, but it was a hotbed for anthropology, and in large part because some of the big names there were pariahs in other places in the United States, like Walter Taylor, who wrote the book A Study of Archaeology, which attacked a lot of the big names in archaeology, so he could only get a job at SIU. And so it attracted people. I remember Fred Plog was offered the job at SIU, and I was told I was second on the list. And I was doing archaeology at the Museum of Northern Arizona here in Flagstaff, and I was down near Chevelon Canyon in Arizona here where they were doing some archaeology, and I got a call that SIU was interested in me, and because Fred Plug had turned them down, and I was so delighted. And Sheila and I went for an interview, and I remember hitting St. Louis and then driving down to southern Illinois and seeing Spanish moss hanging on the telephone wires, so the high wire lines, and wondering what am I going to? And I'm trying to buck up Sheila as we're going in there. It's getting damper and damper and hotter, and there's Spanish moss hanging from the telephone lines, and I said, and there's even a lake on campus, Sheila, and we drove by Campus Lake, which was covered with algae. But we loved it there, and we raised 2 boys there and had a good time. So it had been a wide open field, and then just a few years before I got my PhD, it really tightened down. And so I was very fortunate. And an ecotone is an area between 2 major ecological zones, which has the flora and fauna of both of the major adjoining ecological zones. And so this was a term that was quite common then, an ecotone. And so this is a perfect zone in central Arizona between the lower Sonoran Desert and the upper Sonoran Desert, which has saguaro cactus and pinon pines in it. And I wanted to see if the archaeology reflected the biology of the 2 zones, that is, if it was a mixture of the 2. And that's why I got involved. Started out at Prescott College, which was a very small private college, which went bankrupt after maybe 6 or 7 years after I was there. But what was really interesting was that it didn't have traditional academic departments. It had a Center for Man and Environment, we were colleagues, which had biologists, zoologists, Lynn Hargrave, who was a specialist in birds from archaeological sites, and the natural scientists were interested in archaeology. And Bob Euler set this up. And so it was really a very interesting way to have an interdisciplinary center. And we were all colleagues together. And so this was, not only did we do research that was interdisciplinary, but we lived together, had lunch together, and lived in the same academic building as one another. And Bob Euler, who headed it, brought in people who had interdisciplinary interests. And it was the Center for Man and Environment, and that's how we worked. And it was a wonderful early experience in my career. because Peabody Coal Company was doing mining there. They had signed a contract with both the Navajo tribe and the Hopi tribe because their lease area for the coal was in the Navajo area and the joint use area, which was controlled partly by Navajo and partly by Hopi. And so there have been one site had been dug by the Rainbow Bridge Monument Valley expedition in the 30s. That's the only archaeology done in this whole huge area before we went there. So we, largely because of Bob Euler, got the first archaeology done there since the 30s when Rainbow Bridge Monument Valley excavated one site up there. And it's a huge area. And also it was, the Hopi Mesas are on the south end of Black Mesa. So there was a lot of archaeology on the south end and south of there, and a lot of it in the canyons to the north, but none on Black Mesa. So it was sort of a unknown area. And so it was a really wonderful place to start out. And we worked there for many, many years. I don't think we discovered anything wonderfully new. I think the most wonderful part of the place were the people we hired and taught there for generations. People like Steve Plog, for example, worked up there, and Dick Ford did a lot of work up there in paleobotany. We had field school after field school, and we brought in the big names in Southwestern biological and archaeological and anthropological research. Brought them in as visiting guests, and we had a camp up there, which was a wonderful place. We had a cook shack. We built a cook shack. Students slept in tents, but we had a dining hall that was artificially bolted together pieces of a building, and the showers were 55-gallon oil cans painted black to warm up from the sun above shower heads that we put in. And it was a wonderful place. Our two sons grew up there and got interested in archaeology up there. And we've had many generations of students go through there. And we would have people visit from all over, like Dick Ford from the University of Michigan, and Lynn Hargrave, a specialist in ornithology, and they would come and give lectures in our prefabricated mess hall, lecture hall. But we stayed in tents, and fortunately Peabody Coal Company drilled test holes that were only 6 inches in diameter but went down a long way, which we put a floorless tent over and used for bathrooms. So it was a wonderful experience. The really wonderful thing was that we involved students. For example, if the Museum of Northern Arizona, which is the closest institution to Black Mesa here in Flagstaff, they didn't have the student population, and they didn't have that ability to bring in so many people, like you, for example. And Steve Plog and others from all across the United States. We had so many students and professors, and it was a field school. It wasn't just contract archaeology. We had lectures, Dick Ford on paleobotany, and Stan Olson on paleozoology, and Thor Karlstrom on geology. And they would come in and give lectures to the students. It was a marvelous example of contract archaeology being a learning experience and a research experience combined. That's what was neat about it. Sarge is the first letter from the Southwest Archaeological Research Group. And it was really, the force behind it was really Fred Plug, who wanted to get archaeologists, of which there were so many in the Southwest, saying, look, why don't we all look at a common problem and put in certain characteristics, record certain characteristics to a central project that we can all work on, which was a great idea. And surprisingly, it's not existing today anymore because it's a good idea. It was, how can we collect data uniformly that would address a common problem? And the common problem was, why do people live where they do? That is, the location of people on the landscape across the Southwest. And we were to collect data in a common format. And it was a lot of extra work. But some of us did it, but most of people just found it too onerous to do. I was asked by the central administration at the university to move the big Black Mesa project into the anthropology department. I made the point that it was so big that it would swamp the whole anthropology department. And so the president suggested, okay, let's set up a center for just archaeology, which had, of course, close ties to the anthropology department. But we had our own administration, our own budget, and worked throughout the year, the academic and the summer year. So the School of American Research was a very old institution in Santa Fe, New Mexico, that had sort of devolved into not doing much of anything in anthropology anymore until Doug Schwartz took over and reinvigorated it. And it was very important in the early days of anthropology, and then became very important later on through Doug Schwartz, who became the president and really reinvigorated it. And he got it involved in programs of advanced seminars on very seminal projects about things that are of vital concern to anthropology in general around the world. And he built it up, and I was there as a resident scholar, which they had 4 or 5 people a year for an academic year as resident scholars there, which was perfect if you were on sabbatical. they provided you with an office supplies, a little secretarial assistance, and a stipend. And I was there for a while as a visiting scholar. And it was very successful, especially in terms for the general anthropology community. It was especially important in their advanced seminars, bringing together a group of 12 or 15 people at the most to a week-long seminar where you'd stay at the place in the seminar house bedrooms, and the meals were served in there, the cooking was there, and you'd focus on a particular project. The one I remember the most was the environment and archaeology, and then Southwestern archaeology. And it brought in natural scientists and archaeologists and anthropologists, cultural anthropologists. It was a wonderful idea that Doug Schwartz had, and resulted in a series of very important books on particular topics. And it's an interdisciplinary thing that was founded by a Nobel laureate, Murray Gell-Mann, and a few other people formerly from Los Alamos, and very interdisciplinary. And Murray Gell-Mann, a physicist, a Nobel laureate physicist, who was very interested in archaeology. And so he and I got to know one another, and he got me interested in the Santa Fe Institute, which had various seminars there, multidisciplinary seminars like, like why do people live where they do? Same thing that the old questions. I guess we never figured it out. We were a failure. So Murray Gell-Mann was very interested in archaeology. And he had a brother who was a journalist, a low-level journalist worked for the newspaper in Carbondale, Illinois. And so Murray came to visit his brother, and he got interested in this archaeology of the area. And so we got to meet Murray through him, and Murray was one of the founders of this multidisciplinary think tank of the Santa Fe Institute. So he got archaeology involved there, and me. And so this was a wonderful, wonderful opportunity to get involved with some major thinkers in interdisciplinary thought, from physics to biology to geology to whatever, the universe. I had done all my archaeology in the Southwest, and I wanted to do something totally different. The Black Mesa project lasted so long, and my Central Arizona Ecotone project was in the Southwest. Everything was in the Southwest. Although when my oldest son was born, that summer I worked purposely in the Midwest, a field school in Southern Illinois for one summer, so I could be close to home. But other than that, I wanted to work in a different area because I had worked so much in the Southwest and so for so long. So what's further away, where work wasn't being done and hadn't been done for a long time, or just very little work, was the far western Pacific. And I knew somebody who lived on Guam who was an archaeologist and got me involved. And so I could go to the South Pacific and start doing some work in what was the U.S. part of Micronesia, the Palau Islands. And so I went out there for a few years, and it was different. And it taught me a lot. It was so very different that I looked at things quite differently. Not theoretically, perhaps, but intellectually, the kinds of questions. You had, instead of natural or boundaries that were culturally different, like in the Southwest, you had islands that were actually physically separated and for different times and different cultures. And it was different. And it was so different. I remember taking the historic preservation officer from the Palau Islands to a St. Louis Cardinals baseball game. And because he was not only the head of natural resources, but the commissioner of baseball for the Republic of Palau. I remember taking him to a St. Louis Cardinals baseball game, and he was astonished because there was on their big lighted billboard, it was "Welcome Moses Sam, Republic of Palau." So, yes. It made me think separately about different things, but it didn't make me think about the Southwest differently. It just made me think differently about different kinds of archaeology. The Amerind is a special place. And I remember when I was a graduate student, it's amazing I can remember that far back, but Emil Haury took his seminar out there once when Charlie DePeso was the director. And you know, Haury and DePeso did not see eye to eye exactly in terms of archaeology. And he took his seminar, Haury took his seminar out there, and we were just astonished, the graduate students, by his freedom. I mean, this huge place with all these resources. And afterwards, we were talking to Howard about it, how wonderful it was. And he, well, there were downsides to it too. And he was always very discreet. He didn't want to talk about it, but, he had a personality difference with Charlie DePeso. But that just opened our eyes to what could be done. And so Charlie DePeso was really not part of the real cadre of Southwestern archaeologists. He was independent. He was really the lone scholar. And when the students got back to the seminar, back at the U of A, and we were gushing over the possibility of what Charlie had, because we also went down to Casas Grandes as this Howry seminar, exploring Casas Grandes when Charlie was excavating. It was wonderful. And we thought, this is the best job in the world, you know, just doing archaeology, not teaching, not, you know, just doing what you want to do. And Howard kept saying, you know, well, you know, it's not, you don't have the freedom you think you do there. But everything isn't always as good as it seems. And he was right, which I found out later in terms of the board of directors and some members of the board, the family type members, and the difficulty of dealing with that. It was very difficult in many ways. But the Amarant is still a marvelous, wonderful place. Yeah, I was on the board, yes, when Ann Woosley became director. Yes, and she became director because she and Emil were close, and Howry became really sort of a overall advisor to the Amarant after the Fultons went away. So I was hired at Prescott College, my first teaching position out of graduate school at the University of Arizona was because I got to know Bob Euler at the Museum of Northern Arizona. Then when contract archaeology was just going full bore, the Museum of Northern Arizona had a position for a graduate student at the University of Arizona for a year as helping do archaeology. And so this personal connection was very important, and it is important almost to this day. I mean, I still have great fond memories and enjoy living across the street from the Museum of Northern Arizona, even as an old man. You know? And these early connections were very important. I must admit I've lost contact with most of my fellow cohorts in graduate school. In fact, I don't have contact with anybody in graduate school anymore. I don't know if they're still alive. Like Jeff Dean, for example. I mean, Jeff Dean moved across the street from the anthropology building to underneath the football stadium at the Laboratory of Dendrochronology. And he's been a close friend for many, many years. But you develop new friends depending on your area of interest, where you're working, and you develop new friends. Your students go other places. You follow them. How do you and I get to know one another? You know, a project. You know, people still connect that way. For example, let me give you an example. Lynn Hargrave, who did some of the very early archaeology work in the Southwest, like naming potsherds and getting together a handbook which brought the potsherd together, types and dates and that sort of thing. Bob Euler, when he was at Prescott College, hired Lynn Hargrave, who was an old man at the time, retired, in an old folks' home near Phoenix, hired him at Prescott College for ornithology. He was an ornithologist and collected huge amounts of bird skeletons so he could identify them in archaeological sites. And I got to know them that way. And this is vitally important, that this generation or a generation learns from the older generation and learns what to do and what not to do. The more you can have general interests, like paleoenvironment, for example, and ethnobiology along with general archaeology, the better off you'll be in terms of getting a job and being more involved intellectually. I think that's important as a human being, that you look at various aspects of what are walls in an academic institution. And that started being like Prescott College in my early life, Center for Man and Environment, working with all sorts of scientists in different traditional disciplines. I think that's vitally important, especially as archaeologists. Well, can you imagine what it's like to have a child that thinks what you do is so important that he wants to do it himself? I'm especially glad that and proud that my son became an archaeologist. My father, I think, was disappointed that I didn't follow him into medical school, but I could have never gotten into medical school. And besides, it wasn't anything I was interested in. It's been an interesting career in that as just before I graduated with my PhD, the discipline changed dramatically because of the new archaeology, or processual archaeology, with Lou Binford and all this big thing going on. And I was still a graduate student when this happened. And what amazed me as a senior graduate student was that Emil Howry picked for head of the department, not the chairman of the department, but the head of the department was Bill Longacre, a student of Binford, who Binford started the new processual archaeology, which sort of tore down a lot of the ideas and concepts of the older generation, like my mentor, Howry, and yet Howry brought him into the department at the University of Arizona. This is pretty amazing. So I really was at a hinge point in archaeology, where the students, my cohorts, senior graduate students at Arizona, were of course devotees of Spicer and Howry and Sales. And to find that Howry brought in this new group of processual new archaeologists was astounding to us. I mean, we were dumbfounded. And we were converts then. We became converts. So it was wonderful. It was a wonderful time to see that transition from the Bill Longacres from the Emil Howers to the Bill Longacres kinds of. No, I could have been more progressive, I think. In looking back, I could have evolved more than I did. It's a lesson, be flexible. Always be flexible.
Anything else you want to add?
But don't go after fads.
Okay, sorry.
That's okay.
Is there anything else you want to add?
No, no.
Well, it's been educational and wonderful, and it's an honor to have a senior scholar who's done so much share his experiences and, dare I say, wisdom.
Yes, you dare.
Thank you, George.
Well, thank you, Paul. This has been, thank you for taking me back. But those places that I can barely remember.
You did a great job, Rula. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.